By the freezing winter of late 1806, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte had reached an unprecedented level of power, rarely seen in European history. At Austerlitz and Jena, he had systematically dismantled the Austrian and Prussian military structures, effectively ending their ability to resist his expansion. This map illustrates the scale of his control, which now stretched to the very edge of the Russian Empire. To the east, the Tsar's army remained the final organized force capable of challenging French hegemony. These victories had cleared Western Europe, but they also pushed the French front lines directly against the borders of the one power still capable of challenging Napoleon's control. To launch an effective campaign against Russia, the French army needed a reliable staging ground and local logistics. This map shows Poland carved up by its neighbors. By 1795, the pink, green, and yellow territories were fully annexed, erasing the nation. But with Napoleon's arrival, patriots saw a chance to resurrect their borders after a decade of occupation. While the Polish people sought national salvation, Napoleon viewed their desperation as a strategic asset, a source of manpower and supplies for the coming conflict. While the army prepared for the field, a parallel campaign of diplomacy and influence took place in the heated salons of Warsaw. During this time, Napoleon began a relationship with Countess Marie Walewska, a union driven by clear political objectives. The Countess sought to use her influence to secure a commitment to Poland's freedom. Napoleon, in turn, used the relationship to ensure the continued support of the Polish nobility, securing the funding and resources required for his war. Inside the palace, human relationships were managed with the same calculated precision as the movements of a battalion. On the Polish plains, the physical reality of the campaign was beginning to break the Grande Armée. Thousands of soldiers were falling to disease and starvation in the freezing winter rain. This chart compares the army's movement in previous years to the current winter. In Poland, the daily marching distance stalled. The legendary speed of the French infantry was lost in the thick, bottomless mud. The lack of supplies pushed veteran units to the breaking point. In the isolation of the pine forests, the combination of hunger and cold led some soldiers to take their own lives. Facing the total collapse of his supply lines, Marshal Ney moved his troops north to search for food, ignoring his standing orders to hold the line. This unauthorized movement completely exposed the French position, just as a massive Russian offensive emerged from the blizzard. The Grande Armée had reached the physical limits of its logistics. As the soldiers struggled through the mud, the Russian offensive had already begun to close the distance. When the news of the Russian attack reached Napoleon, his staff prepared for a defensive retreat. Napoleon, however, viewed the surprise attack as a tactical opportunity. He ordered his units into a slow, fighting retreat. This was designed to pull the Russian army westward, stretching their lines until they were vulnerable to a flanking maneuver. His willingness to use his own troops as human bait demonstrates the transactional nature of his genius. Thousands of lives were simply the price of a tactical opening. The winter campaign highlights the divide between the political maneuvering in Warsaw and the physical suffering of the soldiers in the field. Whether managing the national aspirations of the Polish people or the survival of his own men, Napoleon's decisions were governed by the same strategic logic. In his pursuit of total control, every individual life was a disposable resource, a mark of ink to be erased to reach the final objective. By late 1806, the French Empire had achieved a momentum that seemed unstoppable. In just over a year, Napoleon had dismantled the great powers of Central Europe at Austerlitz and Jena, leaving his rivals in ruins. But these victories had not bought security. To the east, the Russian Empire remained intact and defiant, gathering a massive force that threatened to undo everything the Grand Army had won. This created a new geopolitical imperative: total hegemony. In Napoleon's eyes, the only way to protect his existing borders was to eliminate the last remaining continental threat, no matter how far he had to march to find it. The emperor forced his army onward, pushing deep into the Polish plains. By Christmas, the vanguard arrived in Warsaw, extending French power further than ever before. The transition was jarring. The soldiers moved from the paved roads and fertile farmlands of the West into a barren, primeval landscape of frozen marshes and endless pine forests. This move toward the frontier signaled a shift in the emperor's campaign. Every victory now seemed to demand a new conquest, creating a chain of expansion that pulled the army further away from peace and deeper into the unknown. The Grand Army was a military machine built for speed. Its entire tactical system relied on rapid marches and hard-packed European roads to outmaneuver and isolate enemy columns. In Poland, however, that speed-based advantage vanished. Near the town of Pultusk, the French advance hit a wall of viscous, freezing black mud that swallowed wheels and bogged down entire divisions. The environmental friction had immediate consequences. General Bennigsen and his Russian army were able to slip through a potential encirclement and escape, simply because the French infantry could no longer march fast enough to close the trap. Logistically, the army began to collapse. Without the surplus of the German heartland, the men were suddenly without bread, without any wine, or even functional boots. The Grand Army was effectively being dismantled by the landscape itself. For the first time, Napoleon's strategic genius had met an opponent it couldn't outthink: the unyielding physics of the Polish winter. While the soldiers struggled in the mud, the atmosphere in Warsaw was one of luxury. In the candle-lit imperial salons, the emperor was surrounded by Polish nobility eager for his favor. This 1773 map shows Poland's national tragedy: aggressive territorial claims by Austria, Russia, and Prussia, dismembering the country. Tracing these lost territories reveals their desperation. To Warsaw's patriots, Napoleon was the only force capable of reconstructing their nation and restoring these borders. This political hope took a human form in Countess Marie Walewska. Her romance with Napoleon was a desperate gamble. She sought to use her influence to keep the plight of her dead nation at the forefront of the emperor's mind. But in the forests outside the city, the reality was horrific. Behind the political maneuvers, tens of thousands of infantrymen were ravaged by starvation, sub-zero temperatures, and the slow creep of typhus. The environment exerted a crushing psychological weight. Even hardened veterans of the emperor's greatest campaigns reached their breaking point, with many choosing suicide over another night in the frozen Tines. The emperor's ambition had created two irreconcilable worlds: an elegant geopolitical game for the elites and a frozen abyss for the men forced to fight it. By early 1807, the starvation was so acute that Marshal Ney acted on his own initiative. He pushed his scouts northward, desperate to find any villages that might still hold food supplies for his men. Ney's desperate search for supplies led him into a catastrophe. Emerging from a heavy winter blizzard, his scouts suddenly found themselves facing the full weight of a massive, hidden Russian army. General Bennigsen had launched a daring winter offensive, moving to crush the scattered and weakened French corps before they could regroup. This diagram illustrates the peril. As these green Russian columns closed in on the scattered French units, Napoleon didn't retreat. Instead, he saw the Russian movement as an opportunity for a final, decisive blow. He ordered Ney to pull back, turning his own troops into live bait to draw the Russians even further west. While Bennigsen chased the bait, Napoleon moved his main force in a massive arc to strike the Russian rear and seal their fate. It was a masterstroke of cold calculation. To achieve this envelopment, Napoleon was willing to gamble the lives of his freezing, exhausted soldiers, using them as pawns in a high-stakes tactical trap. His mind functioned like a brilliant, consuming fire, capable of redrawing knops and turning chaos into a masterpiece of maneuver, yet operating with a total indifference to the absolute limits of human endurance.
The Battle of Friedland is coming apart for the French right wing. Solid iron is ripping through their ranks, shredding defensive lines, and turning the muddy ground into a chaotic slaughterhouse. Across the river, Russian artillery batteries have found a devastating angle. They are pouring a relentless enfilade fire directly into the flank of the French formation, carving massive, bloody corridors through the infantry. Sensing the collapse, Russian commander Pyotr Bagration capitalizes on the carnage. He orders a massive, coordinated bayonet charge. sending waves of infantry directly into the compromised French lines. The pressure breaks them. Marshal Ney's vanguard, usually the most resilient shock troops in the army, completely loses cohesion. Formations dissolve, and thousands of men begin a panicked, disorganized retreat. This creates a fatal geographic trap. If this right wing crumbles, the advancing Russians will simply pivot and roll up the entire French line from the side, pinning them against the river. A tactical failure in this single sector of mud guarantees the destruction of the army, and with it, the potential collapse of Napoleon's grip on the European continent. Into this vacuum steps French reinforcements, General Victor's First Corps, and with them, a brilliant, calculating artillery commander named General Sennermont. To understand what Sennermont does next, you have to look at how military doctrine viewed these weapons. A standard field cannon weighed upward of 3,000 pounds. They were incredibly heavy, practically immobile on muddy terrain, and virtually defenseless if enemy infantry got close. Strict 19th century military doctrine dictated exactly how to use them. You keep them safely in the rear. From there, gunners lob solid iron balls in long parabolic arcs over the heads of their own advancing troops. Losing one of these valuable pieces of equipment to the enemy was a catastrophic financial loss for the army and an absolute career-ending disgrace for an artillery commander. You do not risk the guns. But Sennermont looks at the collapsing right wing and runs the numbers. Adhering to the established safety protocols guarantees a French defeat. Survival requires throwing the rulebook out completely. Sennermont orders his heavy batteries unlimbered and pushed aggressively forward. His gunners physically drag the massive weapons straight toward the charging Russian infantry. This diagram shows the logic behind his advance. He is switching his ammunition to canister shot. Instead of a single iron ball meant to punch through a line, a canister is packed with dozens of smaller musket balls. When fired, it effectively turns the cannon into a massive industrial-sized shotgun. But the physics of canister shot come with a lethal trade-off. While the spread covers a wide V-shaped area, the individual projectiles quickly lose velocity. There is a severe drop-off in stopping power the further the target is from the barrel. To maximize the damage, Sennermont leapfrogs his batteries completely past the retreating French infantry, leaving his gunners entirely exposed to enemy fire. He halts the advance at exactly 60 yards, point-blank range. At this distance, the French gunners and the advancing Russian infantry can clearly see each other's faces. He has sacrificed every ounce of defensive safety, placing his valuable cannons in imminent danger of capture. In exchange, he has trapped the entire Russian advance within the maximum lethality zone of the canister blast cone. Sennermont is trading the security of the artillery for absolute, inescapable mathematical destruction. Then comes the final escalation. At 60 yards, Sennermont orders his gunners to load double canister shot into the barrels. 30 French cannons aim directly at the densely packed Russian ranks. On his command, the entire battery fires in perfect, deafening synchronization. A concentrated scythe of iron tears through the field. Hundreds of men are leveled in a fraction of a second, completely shredding the front lines of the advance. The legendary discipline of the Russian infantry cannot withstand the physics of the blast. Under this overwhelming mechanized slaughter, their morale instantly shatters. By applying extreme, concentrated firepower at a suicidal distance, Sennermont reverses the momentum of Friedland. The French retreat stops, and the Russian advance turns into a massacre. The surviving Russian forces break their formations. Panic ripples through the ranks as men drop their weapons, fleeing the artillery line in raw terror. But the geography now works against them. Behind the fleeing soldiers, the wooden architecture of the town of Friedland is fully engulfed in flames, blocking their primary avenue of retreat. Pinned between the advancing French bayonets and the burning city, thousands of soldiers are forced to plunge into the deep, fast-moving currents of the Alle River. The final arithmetic of the afternoon is devastating. Over 20,000 Russian soldiers, roughly 40% of their entire fighting force, are killed, captured, or drowned in the river. Sennermont's tactical heresy achieves the total, systemic destruction of the enemy's capacity to wage war. The massive slaughter at Friedland breaks Tsar Alexander I's political will to continue the campaign. He immediately sues for peace along the Niemen River. To finalize the terms,
Napoleon and the Tsar orchestrate a surreal, historic meeting. They construct a custom floating pavilion moored precisely in the dead center of the river, so neither monarch has to step foot on the other's territory. Inside the pavilion, the two emperors host opulent banquets and draft a new alliance, dividing Europe between them and abandoning Russia's former coalition partners. While the two emperors negotiate inside, the Prussian king, Russia's primary ally, is left standing on the muddy riverbank in the freezing rain. He is completely ignored, stripped of his territories, and removed from the geopolitical equation. A single commander's willingness to subvert the rigid rules of artillery geometry at 60 yards saved the French army, destroyed a coalition, and redrew the borders of Europe.